been, the last 2 days were hopefully helpful and illuminating in our discussion, and we have 2 more days. So another basically 3 hours where we will be able to explore the concepts of race unity in the light of the guidance from the House of Justice, which over and over in different ways, if you've read through this whole 19 pages now and looked at it carefully, you'll see that there are several common themes. The most predominant being that this is our pursuit of this freedom from racial prejudice, this theme, has to be completely coherent and integrated with all that we do. This morning when I was thinking about this class, I went back again to that statement in the Advent of Divine Justice that's at the beginning of all the stories of Abdu'l-Baha that are in that Abdu'l-Baha and Race Unity compilation. The section on page 8 that starts, and it's called Examples of Abdu'l-Baha and Race Unity. This comes from the Advent of Divine Justice. Here's one of my old kind of marked up versions. And when I went back to look again at this, which I do with some regularity, you know, I think many of us who've been Baha'is for a long time, we practically have the passages about race unity memorized. But I was just confirming my memory, which is that this is the first thing that the Guardian says after he makes the case that racial prejudice is that the freedom from racial prejudice is the most vital and challenging issue, and then describes how important it is for us to do this work, and then says, let them call to mind the example and conduct of Abdu'l-Baha while in their midst, and then tells us again to revive and perpetuate the memory of those unforgettable instances. So this morning I was thinking about what are the possible reasons why Shoghi Effendi reminded us of Abdu'l-Baha's visit to us? And why would we be calling to mind the example and conduct of Abdu'l-Baha? And what was it about the example and conduct of Abdu'l-Baha? And today I had kind of a fresh insight, which was, and maybe it's because we're thinking about it in the context of this global plan that we're involved with. Abdu'l-Baha was very mindful. You know, in one place, and we'll probably look at this either towards the end today or definitely tomorrow, the Guardian reminds us that freedom from racial prejudice has to be the watchword of the entire American Baha'i community. So a watchword is something we pay attention to, right? It's the watchword, it's the driving force. And the House of Justice has helped us see that this is not something that we set over here to do as an event, but rather that it is something that is woven through everything. So what is a watchword? And then, so with that question in mind, and when we look at what Abdu'l-Baha did, he was very, very thoughtful about it. He did what he did, he did whatever he did on purpose. But it seemed like one of the things that he did on purpose a lot while he was here,
down here with me, listen,
was to find every possible way to demonstrate freedom from racial prejudice and race amity and race unity. And so let's start with just one little example of that. Yesterday we were talking about becoming systematic. And so I thought maybe if you turn to page 15 of this Abdu'l-Baha and Race Unity compilation, it's a very short story. It's not really even a story, it's just kind of a comment. It's the second one down, so number 30. And this is a comment that's in 239 days. And it's actually from Abdu'l-Baha. He says, in Washington too, we called a meeting of the colored and white people. The attendance was very large, the colored people predominating. At our second gathering, this was reversed. So it implies that the number of white people was predominant. But at the third meeting, we were unable to see what color predominated. These meetings were a great practical lesson upon the unity of colors and races in the Baha'i teaching. So look at how systematic Abdu'l-Baha was. He was keeping track. Who came to the meeting? What was the predominant color of those who attended the meeting? Did he have just one? No, he had another one. He looked at who was there. He noted it. He kept a list, in a sense. And then he had a third meeting. And in the third meeting, that meeting had accomplished what he was going for, which was you couldn't say what was the predominant number of people attending this meeting. So if we look at the way in which Abdu'l-Baha carried out his work, everything, none of it was accidental, and he was paying attention, wasn't he? And he was marking his progress. And he was marking not only his progress, but the progress of the friends. And so he also was using the press for his message. And he was very adroit at that. And he used all these platforms where he was a speaker to give the same message with variations on the theme, but the underlying message was the same. So if you look up one to number 29, we touched on this on the first day we were together when we were looking at the talks that Abdu'l-Baha gave at the NAACP convention, and then how he walked over across the street and gave the closing address to the Baha'i National Convention this was the same day, April 30th. This is when Jane Addams welcomed Abdu'l-Baha to Hull House and introduced him to an audience that far exceeded the auditorium seating capacity of 750. Abdu'l-Baha spoke on, what else? The unity of the races. He could have, I mean, Hull House was not known for its race unity necessarily. It actually stood for helping the poor. But he chose to speak about race unity. And he said this, and for those of you who wonder, should we be involving ourselves in what's happening right now? He says, God is not pleased with, neither should any reasonable or intelligent man be willing to recognize inequality of the races because of this distinction. So God is not pleased with, nor should any reasonable or intelligent man be pleased with, be willing to recognize inequality in the races because of this distinction. God is not pleased with us if we recognize, meaning we assume or are willing to give it credence, this inequality of the races because of a distinction which is color. And then as Abdu'l-Baha left Hull House, many children and unemployed men crowded around to meet him, and he gave each coins. So throughout the rest of the time when we look at these stories and when you go back and read them again, I hope that you'll also read them with the lens of Abdu'l-Baha's sort of systematic approach, because that will maybe help us as we figure out how to be systematic and use this freedom from racial prejudice as the watchword while we're pursuing the elements of the plan. Okay, let's now go back to the compilation on achieving race unity from the House of Justice. And we left off reading a fairly long letter to an individual Baha'i that was answered in April of 2011. And so I'll just reprise to remind you where we were. So it's on page 5. And this is the first paragraph. Basically, the House of Justice, as they always do, restates back to the writer what the writer's concerns were. That our vision of race unity tends to be cyclical, that it's in vogue, and then we go back to other things, and then it comes back because something that happens, and then we go back to other things. And the House of Justice, now this was written in 2011, so we had some experience by then in the plan. The House of Justice notes that the pattern you described was a characteristic common to many facets of community life, leading it to, in 1996, to set the Baha'i world on a new course. And then this quote from that 4-year plan message, where they talk about systematization. This is the one that we looked at yesterday. requiring us to be systematic in our thinking. And I think this is something that we're still all learning about. I think that maybe at the national level and the regional level, friends are gaining the capacity to think systematically. It's very much tied to a learning process. The learning process is driven by learning objectives, questions that we are asking and that we return to. We have a question, and then we make a plan and we act, and then we return to reflect on the question that we have that caused us to make the plan for action. Essentially and then we go back to the guidance in view of our experience, and then we make the plan for the next step in terms of how we can explore this learning objective that we have, this question that we have. So that systematization is beginning to sort of take root. And I think the area teaching committees are beginning to learn this skill. I know the Institute, the coordinators, and gradually the tutors are gaining this skill. Local spiritual assemblies are trying to learn how to be in a learning mode and what that means, and how to be systematic and what that means. And when you finally get to that point of being systematic, then you don't run in fits and starts. You're not just sort of buffeted, always reacting, because you're acting, and you have, according to a set of learning objectives that you've sketched for yourself from the guidance. So now let's pick up this letter, and I asked Nikisha if she would be willing to read. She and I were talking before the class. And so Nikisha, are you on? I know you're here.
I'm here.
We're picking up with the paragraph that says, after a decade and a half of systematic effort.
On the compilation?
5. Yeah, page 5 of the compilation. Mm-hmm.
Oh, page 5 of the compilation.
Yeah, 2/3 of the way down the page. Right.
Okay.
Indented quote. Mm-hmm.
Okay. After a decade and a half of systematic effort, a coherent pattern of activity that advances the growth and development of the Baha'i community and its greater involvement in the life of society has emerged. The current stage of progress and the challenges that lie immediately ahead are summarized in the Rizwan 2010 and the 28th of December 2010 messages. From this perspective, it is possible to see how the challenge of addressing racial prejudice is an integral part of 3 broad areas of activity in which the Baha'i world is currently engaged: expansion and consolidation, social action, and participation in the discourses of society. The pattern of spiritual and social life takes shape in clusters that involve study circles, children's classes, junior youth groups, devotional meetings, home visits, teaching efforts, and reflection meetings, as well as holy day observances, 19-day feasts, and other gatherings, provides abundant opportunities for engagement, experience, consultation, and learning that will lead to change in personal and collective understanding and action. Issues of prejudice of race, class, and color will inevitably arise as the Friends reach out to diverse populations, especially in the closely knit context of neighborhoods. There, every activity can take a form most suited to the culture and interests of the population, so that new believers can be quickened and confirmed in a nurturing and familiar environment, until they are able to offer their share to the resolution of the challenges faced by a growing Baha'i community. For this is not a process that some carry out on behalf of others who are passive recipients, the mere extension of congregation and invitation to paternalism, but one in which an ever-increasing number of souls recognize and take responsibility for the transformation of humanity set in motion by Baha'u'llah. In an environment of love and trust born of common belief, practice, and mission, individuals of different races will have the intimate connection of heart and mind upon which mutual understanding and change depend. As a result of their training and deepening, A growing number of believers will draw insights from the writings to sensitively and effectively address issues of racial prejudice that arise within their personal lives and families, among community members, and in social settings and the workplace. As programs of growth and advance and the scope and intensity of activities grow, the Friends will be drawn into participation in conversations and, in time, initiatives for social action at the grassroots where issues pertaining to freedom from prejudice naturally emerge, whether directly or indirectly. And at the national level, the National Assembly will guide, through its Office of External Affairs, the engagement of the faith with other agencies and individuals in the discourse pertaining to race unity.
So, Nikisha, would you stop there? I wonder if you might have some comments about these two paragraphs.
What I see here is I see a directive, and I see not only just an overall directive, but I see them, Universal House of Justice showing us how this can progress if we just start at the grassroots here, having conversations with people who are close by us in proximity, how those conversations lead to the ills that are going on in the world, especially the ones of our own race, and what can happen as a result. It also tells us what not to do in a little bit. It says this is not a process that some carry out on behalf of others. So, we have to be fearless and do it ourselves. And this is what can result, and this is what will result out of it. And every protagonist is doing their part.
I wonder if we might drill down on this a little bit more. It's interesting that right in the middle of that paragraph on page 6, I want to highlight what you commented about, Nikisha. For this is not a process that some carry out on behalf of others who are passive recipients. You see that line there? Everybody got it? But one in which ever increasing numbers of this is not a process that some carry out on behalf of others who are passive recipients, the mere extension of a congregation, and the invitation to paternalism. So I'm looking at the screen. If I'm like Abdu'l-Baha, which I'm not, but we all try to be like Abdu'l-Baha. I'm looking at the screen and I see that the vast majority of people here are white Baha'is who clearly embrace the desire to see the elimination of prejudice, both in their lives and in our society. And for us, because the Guardian has warned us that we might have culturally an inherent sense of superiority, and the Guardian cautions us about paternalism, particularly for us, but I think everyone can ask themselves these questions. How is it that it might be paternalistic? And are any of the things that we've been doing, do they smack of paternalism? And so this is not an opportunity for us to, to get critical of the Baha'i community. It has more to do with our just own opportunity to think in terms of the change in which we need to conduct our affairs, aware that it's so easy because we live in a culture of congregations, right? Faith communities organize themselves in congregations. So either black or white, we're used to having a minister leading us. And then we're passive recipients. We go to church, we have our spiritual, like a devotional gathering. We have a great uplifting spiritual experience, and then we go home. And we rely on somebody to organize it all for us. So the House of Justice is saying it's not a mere congregation, which invites paternalism. What on earth does that mean? So Ruby, do you have a comment? I saw that you've unmuted yourself. Okay. All right. Anybody have a comment about where you might have caught yourself in something that was that sort of paternalistic approach? I don't want you to be pointing fingers at anybody else, so we'll do take our own inventories here. Anybody notice that? tendency that you might have? Yes, Deb.
Yeah, I'm currently a study circle coordinator, and I've had the opportunity of traveling across the mountains to the west side, and both physically and on Zoom. And it seems to me that the challenge is to change the culture. And so some of the third milestone communities' cultures are changing, but how to convey it to our community in a way that doesn't seem like I came from the mountaintop and I'm delivering the word of God kind of thing. And so I've been trying to learn how to share what I'm learning when I learn it, instead of waiting till the moment is right. And so there's an art to it that Abdu'l-Baha seems to have seamless, but there's a lot of learning that goes on with those of us trying to bring the movement forward in a way that isn't just, I know and you don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the Institute is really trying to help every tutor understand that we are not in a position of knowing more than the people in our study circle. We just facilitate the smooth flow of the study. And so we try to avoid having the answers. So Nikisha, can you pop under your mic again and talk a little bit about your approach to your junior youth social justice group that you described? We were having a conversation yesterday, and this is an example on the opposite side of how it is that we don't act paternalistically. You know what I'm talking about?
Can you give me some references so I know exactly?
Yeah. We were talking about your junior youth group and how some of your colleagues Nikisha's a school teacher, and some of her colleagues from school are joining her in this effort that she has launched this summer for a junior youth program that is centered around social justice. So
Okay.
Does that give you enough to go on? If you could tell the story and then tell what your thinking is.
Yeah. So with this social justice group, I'll just give you a bit of background about it quickly so that you have a context. I was teaching 4th grade. My students I've known, of course, since last June, because I did some home visits last spring before they came into my classroom. So I was familiar with them and their parents. We developed a closer relationship. But at the end of the school year, I realized I wanted to start a junior youth group, but these children were too young. They were only 10. So I was trying to think about what I needed to do, what I could do. And I taught them the virtues, 36 virtues during the school year. So they had a background of the virtues. And then I kind of expanded it to include other things. So it turned into a social justice, spiritual empowerment group. And because I was doing so much, I invited others to join me. So there are 2 other 4th grade teachers joined me. The school nurse joined me. The kindergarten teacher joined me. Some Baha'is, young Baha'is, age 19, joined me here and in California and in down by Eugene. And so I had, and Sana joined me. Sana Meshkin, she joined me as collaborators. So we were on the call, and we were looking at stereotypes, and this was a new term for the youth participants, and it took them a while. I mean, they were not responding to questions. So we were asking questions, and they weren't responding to questions. They were slow to say what was on their mind. And some of the participants who responded also were kind of like a couple steps behind us. So I knew that they had a lot of thinking to do. But when we did the debrief afterward, one of the colleagues was wanting to change the programs as such where we could deliver it to the participants in a different way. And I really try to explain that I really want the participants, the youth participants, to be able to own this, to be able to think about what's going on instead of giving information to them, like we're opening up their heads and pouring information into them and asking them to regurgitate it. That's the way they do in the school system. And that's not what our community and what our environment, our society is about. That's not what I want to create. So that moving away from, I'm going to give you this and I want you to use it and I want you to say it the way that I just said it, is a way we're moving away from that. I like to move away from that and move into empowering the junior youth to actually contemplate, ponder, and reflect on what the issues are, and then being able to share their thoughts and feelings.
Thank you. I want to highlight a couple of other things because I think it's helpful for us to kind of expand our thinking. And I know many of you have similar experiences. But do you also notice that in this story that Nikisha was telling about how she organized this, she reached out to a lot of collaborators. Some of them knew nothing about the Junior Youth Spiritual Empowerment Program. They might have known that she was a Baha'i, but they weren't necessarily even students of the faith yet. They hadn't had any experience with Book One. So she was not discriminating in who she invited to be part of this experience. And then, although they wanted to fill in the blanks and they were uncomfortable with the silences of the junior youth and things like that, she let it be what it was. And then afterwards, she reflected with them, helped to raise their vision to the empowerment of people to think for themselves, to understand and to take the time that it's needed to understand. So you see how integrated this whole thing was. It wasn't just, okay, Thursdays, I'm gonna have a junior, or whatever day it is, I'm gonna have a junior youth social action thing. I'm doing it. I'm gonna do this thing. I'm gonna call these kids. I'm gonna tell them what they need to learn, and at the end of the summer, we will have said, we checked, we did this. It was all about actually building capacity, not only in the participants, the junior youth, but also in those people who are collaborating with her. So I think the reason I'm highlighting this is because one thing we can do if we're trying to move away from the congregational, one person doing on behalf of a bunch, is to always think in terms of who are we inviting along on the path with us. Because the moment you diffuse that one into many, that more congregational thing and one person on behalf of another kind of goes away, doesn't it? Also, if we're always thinking about building capacity, not in a paternalistic way, I know and you don't know, but always reaching to wider and wider numbers of people, because everyone has to take charge of their own social and spiritual material destiny, then we can avoid that paternalism and the congregational thinking that we are prone to, because we all were raised up, most of us in this country or in countries where the faith traditions function in a congregational way. So also, I'm wondering if we could go on in that same paragraph. There are some other things, and Nikisha, if you don't mind, I'm going to put you on the spot again. You and I have talked a little bit about the integration of new believers into a community or seekers into a community. And the question that often comes up when we're teaching people whose culture is not necessarily reflective of the dominant culture. What happens then when we try to introduce them? When should we introduce them to the community? Do we need to expose that tender soul to a community that still thinks that the way to show reverence is this, and that we do things by this way, and it's very linear? If a person is from a culture that does not function or think linearly. And so I wonder, Nikisha, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm wondering if you wanted to comment about the rest of this paragraph, where it says, in an environment of love and trust, born of common belief, practice, and mission, individuals of different races will have the intimate connection of heart and mind upon which mutual understanding and change depend. And then it goes on to say, as a result of their training and deepening, a growing number of believers will draw insights from the writings to sensitively and effectively address issues of racial prejudice that arise within their personal lives and families, among community members, and in social settings in the workplace. And then it goes on. So I'm just wondering if you have any comments about that, either from your own experience or from your observation.
Yes, I have some things to say about that. I don't remember exactly where I read it in the writings, but I've been reading quite a bit, and I remember reading somewhere where they have a new believer, and it's okay not to introduce that new believer into the community immediately. Really nurturing that new believer in such a way that they feel comfortable with the writings and the teachings of Baha'u'llah, and actually can own it, take ownership of it, and be able to integrate it into their own lives, with their own neighbors, with their own colleagues in their workplace. They can see how the faith can work in their own lives without getting, this is just me, without getting any, I guess, hints from the Baha'i community. Because what I've found, just recently, with this encounter that I have with this person who's very receptive, is that she's really looking at the teachings of the faith and finding gems in it, and seeing where she can use that in her life and how it applies to areas of her own life. And she has these great ideas that need to be, put into fruition. And she's ready to do that. And she does not need to have anyone comment on the ideas that she has to tell her how good or how difficult that might be to execute, when she's already ready to do things, to take action. Another thing is, I found that with another believer who just declared on Juneteenth, is a real go-getter. I mean, she is, and these are Black women I'm talking about, just to be specific. She wants to, she knew me, and she didn't know very many people in the Baha'i community, but she recently went to a feast and noticed with all the correspondence that what was needed in the community was a calendar for the community, because she found there was some confusion and difficulty in looking up meetings basically on emails, and just having it all on the calendar would just be very convenient. But she got some pushback when she brought that up on a call to her new Baha'i community, which would squelch someone's fire. And that's not what we're looking for, because the outside world are doing things that are great and grand, and we need their ideas, we need the skills, we need all of that. So the encouragement is to have them go for it. Do what you want to do. Let's see how it all plays out, and we're all for it. If some people might give you pushback, that's okay. Not everyone will need what you offer, but what you offer will be a help to the community. And just that nurturing and consolidation, to have it in them, because especially if it's a Black person going into our Baha'i communities in Oregon, it's very shocking, and they're very sensitive and can easily can turn away. Yeah.
Thank you. Derek, I see your hand.
What you said reminded me of my father. One of the issues he had with not the civil rights movement, but the movement to integrate in the 50s and 60s was, he said it wasn't really about integration, but assimilation. And he said that true integration wouldn't occur until white people wanted to integrate, willingly chose to integrate with Black people.
Yeah. And in the meantime, in this statement, right above the congregational statement, the House of Justice says issues of prejudice of race, class, and color will inevitably arise as the Friends reach out to diverse populations, especially in the closely knit context of neighborhoods. There, every activity can take a form most suited to the culture and interests of the population. And so, you know, while the Baha'is are trying to gain this ability to actually really integrate, and it's difficult to know what that looks like for us. And how do we welcome ideas that are not our own? You know, in America, we have a not invented here complex. And that also goes into, I think, every human head. You know, if it's not your idea, it's not a good one. So in areas where we're trying to learn about that integration, it's also helpful to know that we actually don't have to introduce friends from diverse backgrounds whose cultural style may not be the style that has been assimilated, to use your word, Derek, you know, in the way in which a Baha'i community holds its activities. And we can nurture them. So I'll give another example, and then Nakme, I saw you raise your hand too. I've been recently talking with one of the American Indian Baha'is who is really wanting to develop devotional gatherings, which this person doesn't refer to them as devotional gatherings. They refer to them as ceremony, because in Indian country, praying is ceremony. It's drumming, it's singing, it's healing, it's all these things. It has a very specific cultural practice, which is not what you and I might do if we have a devotional gathering. And so I'm encouraging her to feel supported to do what she needs to do within Indian culture. And she's talking about establishing these devotional gatherings, these ceremonies with Indians from the wider community who are now mostly on the west side of Washington anyway, living in urban areas. She also has experienced over the years a lot of pushback where people have told her, you can't have drumming when you're praying, you can't have this, you can't do that, you can't do the other thing. And so as the secretary of the regional council, what I'm saying to her is, we're not going to tell you that here, and please go for it, and we've got your back. You know, we want to see this bloom because it has to be familiar. It has to be a familiar style for people then to be introduced to the revelation of Baha'u'llah. So Nakme, I saw your hand, and then I also see Karen's hand.
Well, I think when we're talking about paternalism and pushback, I think that I think there's often a lot of confusion about the religion of God and culture, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, I mean, I'm not an expert in every single culture, but I could tell you, for example, when someone passes away, why is it that you'll see a Persian Baha'i wearing black for X number of days? And if you question them, if you question deeply enough, you will see that's actually coming from the Muslim culture. It's not coming from a Baha'i culture. So back to how we process things in the Baha'i community, I think what is a little bit more, I think going back to the sentence that we're looking at, how are we welcoming, but how do we also take into consideration the collective knowledge of our community, you know, Erica? And by that, I mean, for example, when someone talks about projects that an institution has taken on for years or has struggled with for years or has not found a way to deal with for years, while it's great to have new ideas, so some people will view it as a pushback, others will view it as, how do you consult about it? And I'm not going to take this wonderful arena to talk about our Portland Baha'i Center and our awesome murals, But I'll let you know that just those two awesome murals have taken hours of the Portland Assembly's, consultation to figure out what to do. And finally, we've come to a resolution. But from the outside, you could say, well, what's the problem? But from the inside, the issue is, you have racism, you have institutional racism, you have also bigger issues. So I think what I'm trying to sit down and listen here with an open mind is we have issues both internally and externally. And while we have new believers who are coming in, how do we view their input? And how do we also share with them what were some of our issues without sounding paternalistic? And for them not to hear that this is pushback. So just listening, for example, to Nikisha talk about calendar, I'm not going to tell you as a secretary how many problems I've had about a calendar, but I can talk to you about for 2 hours about how many problems I have a calendar for a community of 400 people. Please tap on my shoulder and I'll let you know. But is that pushback? Or is that to tell you that I don't know how to solve it? So is that paternalistic? Is that to tell you I don't have skills?
Yeah. Yeah, see, Nakmi, I think this is really good. And I won't go into the details of the specifics that you talked about, but let's raise it up to the level of principle, because that's always where the House of Justice asks us to go. These are really important questions, because pushback is how the person who feels, who's receiving whatever communication, right? So whether we see it as pushback or not, if a person feels that there's been pushback, and I know what it feels like because I'm a person with lots of ideas. So I've grown up with lots of pushback in my life, in the Baha'i community, lots of them, because I bubble over with ideas. One of the things I love about serving on the regional council and serving in this region is that this is at the regional level. This is not, there is no pushback. I work with about 35 people in the region who have mastered the skill of listening and of encouraging. And so no matter what, I feel confident that a person in any of these settings, whatever they say will be received and heard. And then the institutions, will do what they need to do. One example I think that might be helpful for us when we're acting as parents or as institutions is to look at how the House of Justice addresses letters. We always start by saying, we heard you. And they usually then go about proving the point of that the person has been making, right? So I hear you, and here's why what you're saying is important. And then on the basis of the writings, and they're answering bigger questions than a calendar question maybe, but then on the basis of the writings, they unfold things not in a way designed to convince, but rather in a neutral tone that allows people to take away what they want to take away. So it creates an emotionally neutral space where if the person is ready to hear the message of the House of Justice, they can hear it. Like this letter that we're reading now. This was written to an individual. I know the individual, and I know how he agonized about this. This was written to an individual who was feeling like, what happened to race unity? This had been the cause we had all been working on together for so long, and now, since we started this 25-year process, it doesn't appear that the House of Justice is saying much about race unity. So this is burdening this very devout, devoted, very active believer. It was burdening his heart. And so we look at the style in which this letter is crafted. Also, the House of Justice knows this individual. And so they could write to that heart on a basis of actual knowledge, because this is someone who has served for many years. And so they could speak to that heart, confident that they would hear with the ears of a person that's firm in the covenant and wanted to hear what the House of Justice had to say, right? So I think it's really important that we're considering this. Anytime a person marshals back an opposing view, especially in something like feast or where we're not actually in the assembly meeting, we have to be careful that it doesn't come across as patronizing, or as, there's nothing worse than being told, oh yeah, we tried that, it didn't work. Kids don't like it. Youth don't like it. I don't like it. You know, I often is like, okay, well, when did you try it and how long ago and what did you do and how did you actually do it? You know, that you say, we tried that, it didn't work. And I'm like, yeah, how did you try it? And did you actually do all the stuff that would have made it work? And you know what I'm saying? So you start this psychological thing that then becomes a conflict of ideas and turns into a feeling of conflict between people. So we have to be wise. And I think the advice of the Guardian to the white folks is we have to be patient with a lack of response. We have to be patient. And so patience and persistence. So patience often means holding your tongue and making a place. Not every idea is going to be the greatest idea, but if the first time you offer an idea, people say, oh yeah, we tried that, it didn't work. Will you offer the second idea? And will you offer the third idea? It takes a lot of courage and a lot of gumption to wade back in after the first idea you've offered was rejected out of hand because we tried that before.
I'd like to say something.
Yeah, Karen Thomas is next, and then I'll put you on the list, Liz. Yeah, go ahead, Karen.
Oh, our Sunday devotions, we've had an interracial couple coming for a long time before we had to go to Zoom. But what I found was I would ask people during the open prayers to, share a prayer or a chant or something like that. And the gentleman, the husband of this couple, is a psychologist, and he will always bring some little, we call it Neil's nibbles, because he always has some little thing to say, but it doesn't seem like the proper time to me during open prayers. Everybody's like saying prayers, and then he has us do an exercise on closing our eyes and, doing something that is a psychological thing, and it's great. But it always feels to me like the wrong place for him to be doing it. And I was concerned about it, and I talked to a couple assembly members, and there was a suggestion that I ask him to do it at the end, so that we could talk about it. And so I tried that. And then I think he felt like that wasn't working. So he went back to during open prayers. And I feel like for him, that's a real important thing. It's to him like a prayer. He's wanting to share something that is going to help us psychologically in our daily life. And so I feel like that is very important. And so I'm ready to just let him go ahead and do it, even though it sort of disrupts what we're used to of a devotional gathering. And I just like to get some input on that. I don't, I love them both, and I don't want them to go away. So I want to make it something that works for them too, and not be paternal about it, saying this is how you have to do it, or this is how we do it, that kind of thing. I just like some thoughts on that.
So Liz had her hand up, and then I see Nikisha's hand.
Yeah, and I think I can dovetail what I was going to say in with that. Just if we can maybe carry in the front of our minds at all times that paternalism is a rather sophisticated form of bullying, and that's all it is. And so whenever we say, well, we always did it this way, or this is the way we do it, or we've got Baha'u'llah has given us the answer and we're going to share it with you, we're bullying those people. So we need to shut up and listen to them. I like to disrupt my own devotionals. Each time I like to go, what am I going to do different next time? I like to do things differently. I like to present things differently with my LSA, and I do get pushback and say, and I accept, their pushback, but I just say, I'm presenting this because I really want to work against the concept of we've always done it this way. So I just want to constantly present other ways. Some of them will work, some of them won't, some of them you'll like, some of them you won't. But yeah, that's it.
Yeah, thank you. Nikisha.
Yeah, I wanted to just respond to Karen's question, what to do. And yeah, thank you, Liz. Yeah, be quiet and listen is major. Have you listened to this person, have you actually had a conversation and asked why? Why is it important to do it at this time? You know, just whatever you're wondering about, ask the person. Like Erica said, I'm a school teacher, and oftentimes we have these meetings and we're trying to do things for the kids because we see issues, and never do I hear them say, let's just ask the child what they need or what the issue is, or expound on this. They always have this, they conjure up some stuff and think they know what the child needs without even asking that human being. So moving forward in a conversation with things that are not quite understood helps to, one, it's fellowship, and it brings hearts closer together. You can understand people, and it will lead to a different type of outcome than anybody ever thought. Just asking why and having conversation.
Yeah, sorry, Nikisha, I thought you were done. Yeah. If I could build on that, one of the things that we struggle with in every culture, but of course I'm familiar with the dominant culture, is that there are a lot of rules that are actually unstated. So if we can go back to Karen's question about, and not so much about you, Karen, but you've raised a concept of devotional gatherings. I think many Baha'is have a lot of ideas about what a devotional gathering should look like. And when you go and look at what the House of Justice has said, they have not said anything about the structure or the way in which we hold our devotions. Zero, zilch, except that it's prayers, and they refer to spiritual, elevated conversations, like conversations around the teachings of Baha'u'llah. So I have a devotional gathering that we started when my husband was still alive and you know, it's interesting, Marvin and I wanted to have a regular household devotion, but because he had a stream of people coming in for hospice and this and that, it was tough for us to actually pick a time when we would sort of formally have our household devotions. It wasn't until we invited another couple who lives nearby to join us, and they were so helpful and persistent. They would call us and say, when are we going to get together for devotions this week? Because his schedule was always changing. And then, of course, sometimes he would be asleep. But it sometimes took us days into the week before we could actually have our devotions. And they would come over and we would have prayers. But mostly it was fellowship. I mean, when they came, my husband was, you know, he was an island boy. He was from Bermuda. So not only was he Black, but he was also from an island culture, which is a very connecting culture. So you don't walk in, sit down and start your meeting. You walk in and you connect with all the hearts, and you have conversations and you build the fellowship. And then at some point we have prayers. So now that he's gone, and we can actually have our devotions at a regular time, we picked a day and a time. We followed that pattern. And when we come onto the Zoom page, everybody that's there catches up with everybody. We don't even start. We start at 10, but the prayers happen at some point when we know we're done with the fellowship. We've caught up with each other. We've connected our hearts. We've woven the bonds. And then at some point somebody says, shall we have some prayers? And then we have some prayers. And then at some point, even during that time, somebody might talk about what that prayer meant to them. And so it's so our devotional, and it suits us. We go away feeling nourished spiritually and socially, and you know, in so many ways. Now, I'm not saying every devotion needs to look like that. They should look like whatever they're going to look like. But I do say that I think these kinds of conversations might help us all challenge the rules. And you know, another part of I'll just share a little bit of my own evolution. When I was younger, I was very goal oriented, and I tended to kind of be so focused on the goal, like getting this done or solving this problem or whatever, that I did not stop along the way to nurture the relationships. You know, I just sort of assumed those relationships that I had because I was very goal oriented. And then really it was all of my growing friendships among my Black Baha'i friends that slowed me down and made me pay attention to the nurturing of the relationships. And so now let's go back and look again at this sentence where the House of Justice says there, this is so towards the top of page 6, like 6 lines down there, every activity can take a form most suited to the culture and interests of the population. I just want to raise the question. Let's use Karen's devotional gathering. She has a population in that devotional gathering composed of people who are Baha'is and have experienced devotional gatherings in one way, and people who, the population includes this man and his wife. They are part of the population. You see, so it's not Karen's devotions, and it's not even the Baha'i Spiritual Assembly's devotions, it's the population's devotion, which I think is also why, Karen, you're realizing that you have to expand your thinking, right? So the House says every activity can take a form most suited to the culture and interests of the population, so that new believers can be quickened and confirmed in a nurturing and familiar environment. So if there's a bunch of us that are familiar with one way, and we bring a new believer or a new friend of the faith into the circle, and they're seeking for a familiar and nurturing environment, if we are really able to, Derek, thank you so much for that comment, integrate instead of ask for assimilation, then the way in which we do things is going to change. We're going to be very flexible and agile, and we're going to be enriched by it, actually, because it will tear down these made-up rules. You know, the Baha'i community got itself in a lot of struggle. Started to say trouble, but it wasn't really trouble, because we struggled a lot, because in the beginning, when we didn't know what we were doing, people made up a lot of rules. You know, they said firesides don't count. That was a rule. There's nothing in the guidance that said firesides don't count, but somebody made up the rule, and it caused a lot of heartache amongst longtime Baha'is. We're not even talking about cross-racial boundaries or anything else. We're talking about this heartache, unnecessary heartache, actually, because somebody made up a rule and said firesides don't count. Or no, deepenings don't count. Yeah, you can have deepenings, but you first have to do the other stuff. I mean, all these rules. So we ourselves perhaps can go and think about rules that have affected us, and that might give us a little more empathy when we realize that these hidden rules that we impose on other people can be doubly difficult, because as the Guardian reminded us, this lack of response on the part of the people who have received for so long such grievous, what does he say, and slow healing wounds. So even thinking about the experience of longtime Baha'is, mostly white, who went through this period where a lot of rules were made up and a lot of heartache was caused, may help those white Baha'is then have a deeper empathy for people who are coming into a dominant culture that has not integrated but has expressed assimilation, and maybe we can question our rules. And when we question the dominant culture rules, then we begin to be less patronizing, and we begin to be less congregational, and we begin to then really explore what true integration is. When there's love, I think that's easy. Yeah. All right, have I missed anybody else's hands? This has been a very rich conversation. Thank you all for setting us on that path. So, Nikisha, are you still with us? The screen keeps changing.
Yes, I'm still with you. Yes.
All right, are you willing to pick up the letter again and go take us back? We're going back to page 6, everybody. And to the paragraph after the one that we found so rich. It says, you indicate
that some friends wonder whether the Guardian's statement characterizing racial prejudice as, quote, the most vital and challenging issue confronting the Baha'i community at the present stage of its evolution, unquote, still applies to the racial situation in the United States, since it was written so long ago. The House of Justice has determined that it is not productive to approach this issue in this manner, as it gives rise to an implicit and false dichotomy that either what the Guardian said is no longer important, or it is so important that it must be addressed before or apart from all other concerns. Yet the situation is infinitely more complex. The American nation is much more diverse than in 1938, and the Friends cannot be concerned only with the relations between Black and white, essential as they are. The expressions of racial prejudice have transmuted into forms that are multifaceted, less blatant, and more intricate, and thus more intractable. So too, the American Baha'i community has evolved significantly, as is no longer the same stage of its development. It faces a wider range of challenges, but also possesses greater capabilities. The House of Justice stated that the principles Shoghi Effendi brought to the attention of the American Baha'i believers more than 70 years ago are relevant today. And they will continue to be relevant to future generations. It is obvious, however, that the, quote, long and thorny road beset with pitfalls, unquote, upon which the Friends must tread, will take them through an ever-changing landscape that requires that they adapt their approaches to varying circumstances.
I want to pause here for a minute, and did you have any comments, Nikisha, that might kick this off for us?
I have a comment. Okay. This is something that's been on my heart since the start of 2 weeks ago. And that is, you know, and it ties directly in with this increasing complexity and the delicacy of the situation that's going on right now, is that there is a phrase that gets used, which is all lives matter. And of course, that is true. Of course, that's true. But it has been co-opted by white supremacists. Now, this is kind of tricky for us as Baha'is because, of course, as Baha'is, we believe all lives matter. But there's a focus at the moment. Now, I've seen indigenous people from other countries supporting, not diluting it, not saying, well, our life matters too, but saying Black lives matter. They get it. So we need to get it too. That yes, of course, while all lives matter, at the moment, there's a focus. So that's just an example of the complexity of the situation.
Yeah, so it takes us through an ever-changing landscape that requires that we adapt our approaches to varying circumstances. You're making that point. Are there any other comments that people have about this that has stimulated some thought or memories with any of you?
Erica, I don't have any comments on that, but if I just want to say if there are folks on the call who are a little ambiguous about the all lives matters versus the Black lives matter, that needs to be a conversation that we have. Mm-hmm. There needs to be no confusion about what that means and where that comes from. And that's,
you want to say more about that, Nikisha? Please say more.
First of all, I think that is, although it's very strong, I think it is a something that the Universal House of Justice would refer to as in vogue, those ideas and things that are in vogue. And I do believe that the Black Lives Matter movement is in vogue, no matter how good or bad it is. I also, it means, okay, I have a friend, Diane Walker. She's a famous tap dancer. She just posted something on her Facebook page and she said something to the effect that saying all lives matter is like going to somebody's birthday party and saying, I have a birthday too at their party. So if that makes it more clear, then that's good. If not, then we can expound on that. But what's happening with the Black Lives Matter movement is in the Black community, a lot of Black people are going against the Black Lives Matter movement because it's actually owned by people who are not Black. So all those t-shirts and stuff is not supporting any Black business and not doing anything for Black folks. Some of the protesters are taking that Black Lives Matter and going out and doing destructive things when they're protesting. And that's a reflection upon the Black community. Also, on a good note, Black Lives Matter means that please look at us and humanize Black people and do not put us into groups with other folks, because we have something that is quite unique that needs to be, that you need to be aware of, that people need to be aware of. Also, let's see, there's another example where I'm trying to think about Hillary Clinton. She at first said something like all lives matter, but I'm not going to go there because I can't remember that example. Just recently, I think it was just yesterday or the day before, I have my window open in my house, and so I can hear a lot of the talk that's out in the street. And I heard a man, and this is in my neighborhood because, you know, I could hear it in my house. He was really upset, and it was a white man. He was really upset about the Black Lives Matter, something about that. But the gist that I got from it was that he's totally now against it and is even developing a hate for it, probably because someone did something to his property. I'm thinking that maybe they graffitied his property with Black Lives Matter or something like that. And I'm not telling people what to do, but I think for me, it's safe as a Baha'i to separate myself from those things, because the writings and the guidance give us so many terms, so much to look for. They even give us the watchword freedom from racial prejudice, which means so much more. Like you were giving the example of the architects versus the, demolishers. I don't know if you said demolishers, but that's who we are. We're the architects. We don't need to be worried about the destructiveness that's going on. We don't need to be worrying about tearing stuff down. We don't need to be worrying about trying to keep stuff up that is going to crumble. But we have another focus. And like you said yesterday, let them do their thing, because we have something that that we have to do, and that's this architecture of building the kingdom of God on earth. And the way that we do that is just following the guidance. It tells us very clearly, as we read today, what that guidance is and how to do it and how to execute it and what it looks like when we actually do the work. And that's it.
Thank you. So I see Derek's hand, and then Nakme, did I see you raise your hand too? So after Derek. Mm-hmm.
I was involved with, and I am involved with, an organization that will help put together a Black Lives Matter protest in Bremerton. And what they were going to do there, one of the things they were going to do was read the names of, all the people that had been, and there had been a Native American that had gotten shot and killed by police in Paulsbo. And somebody brought up, well, can we put his name? Can we include his name? And then there was pushback that said, no, this is Black Lives Matter. But then somebody brought up and said, well, yes, but it's also about police brutality. And it's also about, and he went into this whole thing about not only stolen people, but stolen land and all this. And the discussion actually got kind of heated for a minute. But, once everybody thought about it, it was decided that yes, that his name should be included.
Yeah. So, having a Baha'i present in that conversation, we have to navigate through all of the pitfalls with our vision of the oneness of humanity, but never shutting anybody else down, right? The moment you shut someone down, they're no longer in the conversation and they're going to go off away. We have to keep people involved in the conversation, and it's tricky. It's helpful for us to remember that we don't involve ourselves with partisan politics, and we don't involve ourselves with partisanship. And so when these things become divisive, that doesn't mean that we run away. If we are able to keep our eye on the prize, and it sounds, Derek, the story you're telling, it sounds like there was this stormy time as people were talking, and then because they were heard, because everybody stayed in the conversation, it found the resolution and actually did the right thing of acknowledging that these, so the exchange of diverse opinions should not trouble a Baha'i. And we don't shun the people who might be engaging in this in the only thing they know, which is a partisanship, you know, a drawing of a line, I'm on this side, you're on that side. We don't shun those people, we shun the line, right? We don't participate in the line drawing. We never demonize anybody. So nobody's the bad guy, everybody's the good guy. We're all doing our best. And so we have to learn how to in the conversations, to acknowledge and raise things to the level of aspiration. So whoever said, you know, this is also about police brutality, they were moving it from the specific, is it Black lives? What about Indian lives? What about this? What about that? Which can become divisive, to something that was more at the level of principle. And then however they resolved it, I'm sure that then everyone felt a sense of unity of thought. But unity of thought is not an easy thing to gain when we're talking about these difficult subjects, and we have to be patient with that process. Yeah. So Nakme, did you have another comment or question? Oh, okay. All right. I was thinking about, again, about how Abdu'l-Baha was so focused on racial unity. And of course, you know, sometimes a part of my mind will go, well, yeah, but he was Abdu'l-Baha. You know, everybody wanted to see him, and the press built him up. And so of course he could speak to a church of 750 people or an audience of 2,000 people, because he was sort of the fad amongst those people who were trying to see themselves as progressive. But then also he kept his eye on the prize. So again, about what was Abdu'l-Baha's method in all this? He kept his eye on the prize. And so he leveraged that he could speak to thousands of people. He leveraged his place in the press. He leveraged it all, not for his own exaltation, but for bringing about the understanding of race unity. So if you look at, we'll go back to the stories for a minute. On page 13 at the bottom, there's some press about interracial marriage. So interracial marriage in 1912 was illegal in most places, certainly not practiced. And it was actually very difficult for people to be married interracially. So of course, Abdu'l-Baha used his pulpit to speak out about it. So here's a bunch of press releases, press commentary that showed up in various places. It's number 25 at the bottom. And it says, he then returned, this is taken from Alan Ward, who summarized the newspaper articles and stuff. He then returned to the hotel for a public meeting attended by some 500 people, many of whom had to stand. Afterward, a number of them, including reporters, followed him to his rooms and asked him questions on various subjects, including intermarriage. This latter discussion caused front page headlines the next day. So the Cleveland News article stated, "Wed races? Question mark? Sure." And then, perfect results follow the marriage of black and white races. All men are the progeny of one. They are of different colors, but the color is nothing. Abdu'l-Baha. So they quoted Abdu'l-Baha. And then they quoted somebody else, a Mrs. C.M. Swingle. "I believe Abdu'l-Baha is absolutely right. It is inevitable that all races will unite. Black and white and yellow will intermarry and make one perfect race. It's the only logical conclusion." And then the Cleveland Plain Dealer reported, "Bahaist approves union of races, : Persian teacher tells Cleveland women interracial marriages results ideal." The article, which ran the length of the front page and concluded on page 3 with several column inches of photographs, stated, "Abdu'l-Baha, a venerable Persian now touring America as leader of the Bahaist movement for a universal religion, declared last night for an amalgamation of the white and Negro races by intermarriage." And then they quote him, "All men," said Abdu'l-Baha, "are progeny of one, Adam. They are of different color, but color is nothing. Men of all races are brothers. God is neither black nor white. Perfect results follow the marriage of black and white races. My own family in Persia was a Negro, in my own family in Persia was a Negro slave who was freed. She married a white man and her children married white men. These children are now in my household. The results of the union were beautiful. They were wonderful, perfect. So Abdu'l-Baha fearlessly moved forward, but in a way where he just kept to his theme. One humanity, God doesn't see color. They're all members of the same garden. I mean, that was the theme that just went through all of his talks, and he stuck to it. So he knew the principles, he stuck to his message, he used his pulpit for this message over and over and over again. I want to now, let's take a moment and look at Abdu'l-Baha in the way in which he actually interacted with people, and also kind of how he put some of them on the spot. You know about Abdu'l-Baha and let's see, I have it marked in here, where Abdu'l-Baha disrupted a social luncheon in Washington, D.C. Let's see, and it's in here on page, it's the top of page 10. So let's see, Derek, I know you like to read. Would you read that? This is an excerpt from Agnes Parsons' diary. It's number 13. Thanks.
Number 13?
Number 13. Where is Mr. Gregory?
Oh, I'm looking at the wrong
10.
page. It's number 13.
Yeah, sorry. This is the compilation on Abdu'l-Baha and race unity.
Yeah, but for some reason, all my pages are all mixed up.
Oh dear.
Okay.
Well, it's at the very top and it says, "Where is Mr. Gregory?"
Yeah, okay, now I found it. Where is
You
Mr.
got it.
Gregory?
Go for it.
Okay. During the visit of Abdu'l-Baha in the United States in 1912, a luncheon in his honor was given in Washington by Mirza Ali Quli Khan and Madam Khan, who were both Baha'is. Khan was at that time charged the affairs of the Persian legation in the capital city. Many noted people were invited, some of whom were members of the official and social life of Washington, as well as a few Baha'is. Just an hour before the luncheon, Abdu'l-Baha sent word to Louis Gregory that he might come to him for the promised conference. Louis arrived at the appointed time and the conference went on and on. Abdu'l-Baha seemed to want to prolong it. When luncheon was announced, Abdu'l-Baha led the way and all followed him into the dining room except Louis. All were seated when suddenly Abdu'l-Baha stood up, looked around, and then said to Mirza Khan, "Where is Mr. Gregory? Bring Mr. Gregory." There was nothing for Mirza Khan to do but find Mr. Gregory, who fortunately had not yet left the house, but was quietly waiting for a chance to do so. Finally, Mr. Gregory came into the room with Mirza Khan. Abdu'l-Baha, who was really the host, as he was wherever he was, had by this time rearranged the place setting and made room for Mr. Gregory, giving him the seat of honor at his right. He stated he was very pleased to have Mr. Gregory there, and then, in the most natural way, as if nothing unusual had happened, proceeded to give a talk on the oneness of mankind.
You know, we all, I'm sure, have thought about this story many times because it's often told. It took me years to think about how it must have felt for Louis Gregory to be sitting in that room, because he knew he wasn't welcome. Only his love for Abdu'l-Baha and his courage would have allowed him to sit there. Imagine this Black man sitting in the place of honor in a room full of people who had never had a meal with a Black person and certainly wouldn't have expected it in this setting with all these socialites, and the courage that it took for him, and also Abdu'l-Baha's confidence in him, that he knew he could take it. You know, he picked a few people and he put them in hard places. He did the same thing to Corinne True. Similar thing, not with the luncheon, but he he asked her he asked the Temple Unity, or told the Temple Unity that she was to be the chairman. And those men had never been chaired by a woman before, and they made her life very difficult, very difficult. But Abdu'l-Baha knew that she could take it. And in fact, just before he was leaving to go to California, she mentioned to him that her life has been very hard and very sad. And he said, yes, I know, I sent those things to you. She's the one that he revealed that wonderful passage in a letter to her. He says that the more troubles one sees, the more perfect one becomes. And then he gives all these examples. The more you plow and dig the ground, the more fertile it becomes. The more you sharpen the steel by grinding, the better it cuts. The more you put the gold in the fire, the purer it will become. The more you cut the branches of a tree, the higher and stronger it will grow. And then he ends up, after all these examples, he ends up saying, therefore, I am happy that you have had great difficulties. For this, I am very happy that you have had many sorrows. And then finishes by saying, strange it is that I love you, and still I am happy that you have had many troubles. Eric, you have your hand up.
Yeah. This may be going off on a tangent, but you mentioned about how Abdu'l-Baha knew Louis Gregory could take it. I recently read an article and found out that, when Jackie Robinson integrated baseball, he wasn't just a random choice. He was chosen specifically because they figured he was the one who could go in there and take it.
Yeah. And I think every Black Baha'i, you have to sometimes console yourselves that you have been chosen by Baha'u'llah because you also can take it. Because it hasn't been easy, let's be truthful, it hasn't been easy for the Black friends in this largely white Baha'i community, except in certain areas where it's not largely white. Their experiences, if you take the time to sit down and talk with Black friends, they will tell you story after story after story after story of how they've had to hold on to their faith in Baha'u'llah to make their way through a community that is still more about assimilation than integration. Eric, you gave me a term that I am going to keep. I'm keeping that concept. Thank you, Dad. All right. So I won't read the footnote at the bottom of page 10, but I think you should all read it. It just describes Agnes Parsons and her and who she was, and how she didn't actually go to most of these interracial gatherings because it was not her social class. And yet Abdu'l-Baha chose her to host the first Race Amity conference. So he didn't look at the outward. He actually must have just looked at her devotion to the cause, because that she had in spades, even though her behavior was not always an icon or a paragon of race unity. And she doesn't report most of the meetings where he was in interracial groups because she wasn't there in her diary. Yeah, so that footnote is there. Friends, we have just a few more minutes. I'm wondering if we can go back and finish this letter, this 10th April letter, and then if we have time, I have one more story I want to share. Nikisha, are you still up to reading for us?
Yes, I'm available.
Oh, good. Thank you. Wish we could see you, but I know you're probably on your phone, right?
Yeah, I'm on my phone and then I'm looking at my computer.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Excuse my
sweetie.
I was just getting ready. I have my work starting pretty soon, so I was just yeah, not here.
Thank you. All right. So on the top of page 7 in the 28 December message, just to help everybody get back to where we were.
Okay. In the 28 December message, the House of Justice explains that, quote, a small community whose members are united by their shared beliefs, characterized by their high ideals, proficient in managing their affairs and attending to their needs, and perhaps engaged in several humanitarian projects. A community such as this prospering, but at a comfortable distance from the reality experienced by the masses of humanity, can never hope to serve as a pattern for restructuring the whole of society, unquote. Even if such a community were to focus the entirety of its resources on the problem of racial prejudice, even if it were able to heal itself to some extent of that cancerous affliction in the face of such a monumental social challenge, the impact would be inconsequential. Therefore, their friends must effectively assess the forces at work in their society and, beginning in neighborhoods and clusters, contribute their share to the process of learning and systemization. Did I say it right?
It's a tough one. Systematization.
At systematization, which at their numbers, knowledge, and influence growth, will transform their lives, families, and communities. Only if the efforts to eradicate the bane of prejudice are coherent with the full range of the community's affairs, only if they arise naturally within the systematic pattern of expansion, community building, and involvement with society, will the American believers expand their capacity year after year and decade after decade to make their mark on their community and society, and contribute to the high aim set for the Baha'is by Abdu'l-Baha to eliminate racial prejudice from the face of the earth. Continue.
Yeah, just read that last short. That's the end of the letter, the next one.
It is the ardent hope of the Universal House of Justice that the believers will appreciate the potentialities that exist within the current pattern of their organic activities for the realization of Baha'u'llah's highest aim for humanity, and that they will seize their chance and commit their time, their resources, their energies, indeed, their very lives to these critical efforts for the betterment of the world.
Yeah. So yesterday we actually spoke quite a bit about the way in which the activities that we're engaged in the faith are the avenue through which we will carry out and both develop our own freedom from racial prejudice and then help erase racial prejudice in the communities. It's difficult sometimes to think that we start small and we expand. Remember yesterday I talked about the expanding nuclei that we're all going to be learning more and more about and being more thoughtful and systematic about. But we have to, because the solution to the freedom from racial prejudice is not legislation, although we need legislation. It has to do with changing of hearts, and that's a one heart at a time thing. The more hearts we engage with, the more of an impact we can have. Not just us, but the more hearts we engage with other hearts, the greater the impact we will have. So all of us, if every time we're thinking about, we got to do something about the race issue, our minds have to turn to, okay, then which of these core activities can I nurture and expand? How can I raise up capacity in others so we can scale? You know, the leading clusters in the world, I just saw on the Baha'i World News Service that there are 100,000 core activities in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. 100,000 core activities. So let's say that those core activities have, maybe let's just say, to make it easy, that those core activities have 10 people in them. Now I know they have more. The children's classes probably have more than 10 kids. The junior youth programs probably have more than 10 junior youth. The devotional gatherings probably have hundreds of people gathering. The study circles, maybe they have 10 or more. But let's just say that they have 10 people engaged. 100,000 times 10. So, well, it's a million, isn't it? I'm not a mathematician, but I think that's a million. Okay.
1 million, yeah.
That's 1 million. All right, so they have engaged 1 million people with the vision of Baha'u'llah. They've become very systematic now. They know how to go into a cluster that has no Baha'is and in just 2 cycles, raise up a second milestone, an intensive program of growth in that cluster. They start by teaching enough about Baha'u'llah's revelation so people can understand what it is that they're doing, and then they start raising up the resources for those core activities. If you go into a cluster where there are no Baha'is, you go into a cluster where there are no resources. And so they go in and they start raising up resources. They invite youth to be animators and children's class teachers. They begin book ones all over the cluster with the people in that cluster. They begin devotional gatherings. They gradually move people through the sequence of courses. They raise up animators, they raise up children's class teachers, they raise up tutors. And they strengthen the devotional gatherings until they become ubiquitous in the village.
And that's why they're building a temple.
Yeah, they're building a national temple, right? So the DRC did not start out with 100,000 people engaged. Just a few years ago, they were at 10,000 core activities. And we were all blown away. We had never seen a cluster that had 10,000 core activities. Well, they haven't waited, they haven't stopped. They're just continuing. I was going to share another story, but maybe I'll start it with you tomorrow because it deserves more comment. But I want to share a story. I may have shared it with you if you were at Sheltering Branch or some other place the year that I came back from the International Convention when Frontiers of Learning was released. And in Frontiers of Learning, when the National Spiritual Assembly members arrived at the International Convention that year, you know, that the year of the International Convention, we don't get the Rizwan message until it's read at the International Convention, and the International Convention is always towards the end of the Rizwan period. So I was pretty eager when I got to Haifa to pick up my packet because I thought I knew that the Rizwan message was going to be in it. And instead, what was in it was this 17-page document called The Frontiers of Learning, and a cover letter from the House of Justice asking all national spiritual assemblies to study this document prior to the convention. So the convention, when you go to International Convention, the House of Justice hosts the National Assembly members and the Continental Board of Counselors members on a 3-day pilgrimage. And it's of course, it's lovely. And so we're visiting the shrines and we're visiting some of the holy places, and we're all in buses of 25 people, and it's very organized and very beautiful. And about midway through that 3-day pilgrimage, it began to occur in all of our NSA minds that the House of Justice had asked us to study this rather long document. And so groups began to form themselves spontaneously, mostly in the pilgrim houses. Now, sometimes it was by National Assembly, and some we wanted to cross-pollinate with others. So I joined a group that had people from various countries in it. And in the early part of Frontiers of Learning of that document, now we had no idea about the film at that point. We only were looking at the document. In the early part of that document, the first cluster that's highlighted is the Lumumbashi cluster in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And we're reading about this incredible 10,000 core activities and thinking, how on earth? I mean, we came from a country where we didn't, at that time, this is 2013, 2013, we didn't have any cluster in our entire country or in North America that had even 1,000 core activities. So it seemed pretty startling and amazing to us. And we were looking around and nobody in the group knew anything about what had happened in the DRC. But one of them spotted one of the Continental Board of Counselor members from Africa who they knew, and they signaled for them to come, join us for a minute. This man used to live in the Congo, so he was there in on it in the very beginning, and then he now lived in another country. So he was able to tell us some of the background. And it was just that they rolled up their sleeves and they started building capacity in people. Rather than having that, remember we're talking about avoiding patronizing and avoiding that congregational attitude. Well, the Baha'is in the DRC, they started building capacity in people from the wider society right away. They read the guidance and they followed it. And they had that in their mind to build capacity. So just as he was sort of winding up what he knew and we were looking back at our document, there was a hush that fell over the room, and we looked towards if you've been to the Pilgrim Reception Center at Batchi, you know that you walk into this big kind of lobby area, and then there's this big wide open like an arch. It's not an arch, but it's a big opening into the main room where there's lots of seating area. And so it's almost, and the seating area is, a lot of it is sunken. So the reason the hush had fell over the room was that all eyes had turned to that area because all 9 members of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Democratic Republic of the Congo had just walked in together. And they walked in, and it was as if the DRC is in the house, because here are these very dark-skinned men, most of them really dark-skinned, wearing their brilliant, colorful, traditional dress. And they had walked in together and then stopped for a moment to kind of survey, to see, where would they sit, basically. And they spotted the counselor that was sitting with us. And so they came over to greet him, and therefore we had a chance to ply them with questions. I'm not going into all the details that we heard from them. Some of it was just went over our heads because we didn't have the experience yet. But I will say that they were the rock stars of the International Convention in more ways than one. At the very end of the convention, the last day when the convention ends, there's some time before the convention ends at noon, and we have time until sunset to leave Haifa, which means that there's time for us to be in the gardens. And I was walking in the garden with another friend from National Assembly of St. Lucia at the time. And we were up in the monument gardens. And as we were walking towards the gate to leave that area, here came about 5 of these men from the DRC. And the one thing that I noticed about the International Convention was there wasn't a lot of music. It was really very much focused on the consultation. And I had hoped actually to be able to experience the music that I knew must be happening somewhere, because African people generally, they're always singing. And so when we greeted them and just chatted for a minute, I mentioned to them that I had been disappointed that I hadn't been able to actually participate in or hear any of the music from any of the African delegates. And they all looked at each other and they said, "Would you like us to sing?" And their faces just lit up. "Would you like us to sing?" And I was like, "Oh, yes, I would love it if you would sing." And I can't remember whether there were 5 or 6 of them, but they looked at each other. They didn't say a word. They just looked at each other. They figured out through their looks which one of the passages from the writings they were going to sing. And they began to sing in 5-part harmony or a 6-part harmony. Every voice was at a different harmonic level. And it was stunning. So we were standing with the Shrine of the Bob on one side, the Monument Gardens on the other, the House of Justice building in the backdrop, listening to these men who'd been working so hard to bring about this establishment of the core activities to this level, where they were now the leading cluster in the world. And they were praising Baha'u'llah through this song. They actually sang several songs before we parted ways. So I hope you can hear in your mind what that might have sounded like, because if you listen to African country, African music, you know the kinds of sounds that are ubiquitous in most of the countries. I'm sure there's regional differences, but it's a similar sound because everybody sings. Yeah. So on that note, friends, we're just a little bit over 11 o'clock, so I'm going to end. Tomorrow, we're going to focus on the watchword, what that looks like, and look at through the lens of Abdu'l-Baha's stories more in terms of digging into how you can see him using this watchword. Hopefully spend a little bit of time allowing each of us to think in terms of how we can be as mindful as Abdu'l-Baha was about this topic of race unity and freedom from racial prejudice, which really means, Derek, again, thanks to you and your father's comment, an integration rather than an assimilation. The integration, in the words of the Advent of Divine Justice, an interracial fellowship, a true fellowship of hearts, and how that would express itself in every one of these core activities that we're carrying out. And then we'll end tomorrow by reading the statement from the National Spiritual Assembly. All right. So thank you all. Thanks for spending this hour and a half. Love you all. Thanks so much. Hi, thank you.
Bye, Erica. Thank you.
All right, we'll see you tomorrow.